Hi everyone, welcome to week 11, the last week of new content. So we're nearly there. And now that I have a new computer, I have some pretty new colours to use on slides, so even better. So today we're going to talk about corrections and victimology. First half corrections, second half victimology. But I want you to have a think about something. What is corrections? What does it do? What does the term corrections imply? Are we hoping to correct something like bad behaviour? So what actually is the correction system? Well, it has many things, parts and many functions. So we're putting people away. But is prison the only option? It's about punishment, probation, parole, community service, house arrest. So when the case is finished in court, it goes to corrections, whether that be incarceration and in prison, or whether that be in the community. Let's have a look though at who goes to prison. Well, nationally, more people are going to prison. As you can see there, Australia's imprisonment rate has more than doubled in less than 40 years. In 2017, it was 216 people per 100,000. What do you reckon it would be in the US? Horrendously high. So currently we've got more than 41,000 people across the country in prison. Do any of you come from a town that's around that sort of number? Think about your whole town being in prison. Imprisonment rates do vary between Australian states and territories. And which state or territory do you think has the highest imprisonment rates? Well, it's the Northern Territory, followed by Western Australia. So it is argued that increasing the imprisonment rates are a function of increased punitiveness rather than increasing crime. We all know that crime is not increasing, and yet we have more and more people in prison. And that's just a reflection of society where they want people to be locked up. And that's what punitiveness means, how harsh we want to be with our punishment. And how much should we punish people? Okay, so our rates are going down. Since the 1980s, it peaked into the 90s and it's been declining since then. What is our current murder rate? Well, our current murder rate in Australia is about 1 per 100,000 people. That equates to less than 300 in a population of 25 point something, 26 million per year. So it is quite low. Prison is a young man's game. Have you ever heard that saying? It's said quite a lot. So men are far more likely to be incarcerated than women. And what age are they? Well, we'll talk about that as we're going. But the imprisonment rate for men is approximately 12 times that of females. Even though us girls are still 50% of the population, we are not imprisoned at anywhere near the same rate. It has, however, been increasing, and it is increasing at a rate sometimes greater than that of men, but we're still not catching up at all. Because who do we not want to put in prison? Well, we don't want to put children and women in prison. Happy to put men in prison, but not mothers and grandmothers. So there are less than 4,000 women that are locked up. What age are people likely to be incarcerated? Well, 77% of our prisoners are aged 20 to 44, which is more than 3/4 of prisoners. However, the prison population is greying. The number of prisoners over 50 has been increasing. And there's a couple of reasons for this. Now that we've got a lot better at doing scientific DNA type evidence, a lot of people are getting caught for crimes that they've committed decades earlier when they start to get really, really old. Because the sort of crimes that older people get into is more likely to be drugs or something if they're committing the crime now, but a lot of them are being caught in later life for crimes that they committed a long time ago. We are also seeing people who are put into jail for a very, very long time. This isn't seen quite as much here, but they get really, really long sentences in the US for quite minor crimes, so you have this greying population. I do know that over at Brisbane Correctional Centre, they have like an aged care wing, where some of the younger prisoners are actually learning and getting certificates and certified in aged care, so that it gives them something to offer when they're released from prison. But these are people, or men in this case, that have been there for a very, very long time, and they are now reaching that stage where they need that care that older people need. So how does this all relate back to the age crime curve? Does it sort of fit in with the age crime curve? Well, yes, it does, because most crime is still committed by younger people. Older people don't just usually tend to wake up one day and decide that they're going to become criminals. So for males, prisoners either sentenced or unsentenced, the most common offences and acts were acts intended to cause injury, so things like grievous bodily harm, sexual assault, and unlawful entry with intent. For female prisoners, the most common ones are illicit drug offences, acts intended to cause injury, and unlawful entry with intent. So overall, women don't tend to have as much violence in their offending as men. But that is starting to change a little bit as well. Okay, who goes to prison? Well, Indigenous peoples are really overrepresented in the prison population. They actually only make up about 2.5%, maybe a little bit more of our general population, but over 1/4 of our prison population. Almost 1 in 3, the imprisonment rate is almost 1 in 3 for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Okay, and the numbers are much, much bigger in the Northern Territory and Western Australia, and you'll see similar trends in America with their Native Americans. So that is a really, really big problem that we've got here. A significant proportion of the prison population comes from socially and economically marginalised backgrounds. So many of them are unemployed prior to their incarceration. Low levels of education and history of underachievement, usually an incomplete education, usually around year 10, so not going on to do year 11 and 12, but then not leaving school and going to a job or an apprenticeship either. Underachievement, what theory could support this? We could talk about labelling theory. We could talk about strain theory, where people have the goals but no means to achieve them. Limited employable skills and work experience. If you have employable skills and work experience and can get a job, there's no reason for you to commit crime if you've got these things. And they can sometimes have a history of mental health problems and drug use. Do you think they might also have family issues? More than likely they are. Many female prisoners have histories of physical, emotional and sexual abuse. And when you do sociology of crime in year 2, you'll see how females have really, really different pathways to offending. And this is also explored in a subject called Gender and Crime, which is not a core subject, it's an elective. So you'll have to pick that if you want to do it. Okay, almost 1/4 of prisoners are unsentenced. And this is higher than America, actually. How can you do this? Well, we have so many prisoners who are on remand. They've been remanded in custody and they're there sitting, waiting to have their day in court. They have not been found guilty and not been sentenced, but they have been remanded in custody. Sentenced prisoners most likely to be serving a sentence of 1 to 5 years. The average time predicted is 6 years for a sexual assault committed in 2017. So this means basically, if that's the average time, means half or less and half or more. So 6 years is the average. In December 2017, only 7.5% of prisoners were serving time for homicide. So it's really, really quite a small number of our prison population is in there for murder. The average time that they're in there is 12 to 15 years, and only about 3% have life, where it's life never to be released. And they have their papers normally marked that. So the 5 men who raped and murdered Anita Cobby were one of the first lots in Australia to ever have their papers marked never to be released. One of them has now died in prison and the others are all still there. Okay, so Male prisoners have been increasingly more likely to be imprisoned for violence, sexual assault, unlawful entry, robbery and drugs. What does all of this, if you look at the remand figures, say about our criminal justice system and our court? It just says, our criminal justice system and punitiveness. Well, it tells you that our courts are very, very slow, and they really, really are. If people are on remand for a very long time, then our courts are moving very, very slowly. The US have a totally different system too, and we need to take that into account and acknowledge it. If your sentence is less than a year, you spend it in a jail, which is different to prison. If you get a sentence that is longer than 365 days, then you go to a prison. So very, very different system in America. There is an increasing trend for female prisoners to have been incarcerated for violent offences, but still very, very small numbers, but it has gone up a little bit. Drugs are the main proportion of female offenders. Okay, so the take-home point from all this is that prisoners are not a homogenous group. They're not all the same. There's many subgroups. They're not all 35-year-old white males like in Criminal Minds. Who does all the school shootings in the US? Well, it's young men less than 30 years old. So if you let them have access to guns when they're really pissed off, then that's what happens. When females do crime that are non-gender conforming, then they're always treated more harshly. So there is a view of how us as females are supposed to behave. And a non-traditional female behaviour is violence. That's a male behaviour. And that goes back tens of thousands of years. Okay? So when females act outside of the traditional roles, they quite often get made an example of. And they can get given names like Black Widow, Angel of Death, and things like that. Especially when it's women who hurt children or commit sex offences. Okay, so this was written by Smith and Rinn. John Rinn works at Griffith University. He actually runs the Intro to Forensic Psych first year subject over there, and he is a forensic psychologist. And this is what they said. The changing and heterogeneous nature of the prison population poses new challenges for Australian correctional administrators in terms of security and control, treatment and rehabilitation services, and not least in terms of the costs of keeping them in custody. So that leads to the question, is prison effective? Well, it depends upon how success or effective is measured. Operationalise the word effective. What does that actually mean, and how can we actually measure it? So what's the purpose of prison? We've discussed the principles of punishment before, and this is them again. Retribution, deterrence, rehabilitation, incapacitation, and reparation. Reparation doesn't come into it quite as much, but the other four big ones definitely do. So effectiveness is often measured in terms of recidivism, measured as reconviction or re-imprisonment. But can we measure it in lots of different ways? Could we say that prison's been effective if someone has integrated back with their family and their community, they've got a job, they've got security, but usually we just use recidivism. So if they don't come back, has it done its job? So what are we really trying to achieve here? Do we really care? I'm sure all of you do, but do others? But the big question here is, do you think prison works? So let's go back and just see how effective it is. Approximately 2/3 of prisoners have had a previous prison sentence. A quarter of prisoners receive a further conviction within 3 months of release. So if you let 100 out of jail, 25 are back. Within 2 years, 35 to 41% of prisoners will be re-incarcerated. And within 3 years, that'll rise to 67%. So prison's obviously not a deterrent or working, or they wouldn't keep coming back. And these high recidivism rates are consistent. You can look at 100 years ago and it happened then. Why do these things remain consistent over time. Crimes have changed, but prisons haven't. They used to execute people regularly. That stopped, so now there's more in prison. But people in prison has not changed. So you need to remember that 2 out of 3 prisoners currently sitting in Brisbane Correction Centre have been there previously. There's a lot of therapeutic programs that happen in prison. So cognitive behavioural therapy, which is not just about talking, but addressing their behaviours and their criminogenic needs. So criminogenic needs are things such as drug use, anger management, hanging out with people that will cause you to commit crime, those sorts of things. They're criminogenic needs. They're often offered in conjunction with programs to increase education and employability or job skills. And there's always going to be some in prison who will do something just to alleviate the boredom, but there are a lot who will actually get a lot of job skills while they're in prison. Mixed evidence as to whether this actually works, and a lot more research is required. There's been a lot of research into sex offenders. So what goes on inside prisons? Well, some women's prisons have call centres. You could be talking to a prisoner. They have other industries such as making uniforms for defence in the US. In Australia, prisoners at Brisbane Correction Centre are involved in a whole range of activities where they're learning. Believe it or not, if you want to know how to do laundry, that is a certificate. So there is a lot of laundry that goes in and out. So there are prisoners involved in doing that. There are prisoners that are actually working in the kitchens in food preparation. So yes, they have access to sharp knives, but the knives can never be taken away because they're all tied down. But they are learning skills in food prep, might lead on to them doing an apprenticeship in cooking. As I mentioned previously, there are some who are in aged care. There are workshops where they're learning how to have more technical skills. There are classes that they can do. You can actually do a degree while you're in prison. So most people, if you ask them, would say they want to have therapeutic programs in prison and they want people to be learning skills so that they can get a job and live a normal life when they come out. But being in prison may dilute the positive effects of therapeutic programs. The negative effects of prison might make it negative, okay? And that might explain why recidivism is high despite these programs. But despite this, imprisonment continues to be a popular mode of punishment. Prison is expensive. It is really expensive to keep someone in prison compared to keeping them in the community. Prison does not work except for incapacitation. So we are simply stopping them from committing more crime. It doesn't work for most people that are put in there, but it is becoming more popular. So why is it so popular with the public? What theory do you think this relates to? Those of you who are doing 1008 or Social Problems of Crime with Sheena, have a think about what theory you think this relates to. Well, it could relate to functionalism. We need an us and them, and we need to be able to get rid of them out of our community so our community functions. Okay, we're briefly going to touch on prison privatisation here, because these have increasingly been a feature of correctional services in those 3 countries, including ours. Did you even know about this? Did you know that Australia's first private prisoner in 1990 was the Barallan Correctional Centre? And since I did this slide, Arthur Gorrie has just gone back to government control after being privately owned since it opened. It's only, well, now we're in September, I can't say last month, in July, that it went back to government control. So what is a private prison? Well, shareholders will own shares in that prison, so they are registered on the stock market and they make money off prisons. It's run by a company. One of the companies that runs them is called the GEO Group, and they can do lots of different things. So they can be involved in just the construction of the prison. So instead of the government building the prison, a private company builds it and then on-sells it to the government. They can run and provide the services to the prison. So they're not involved in the building, but they run the prison and manage it and treat it like a business. Or they can be just tended to build and operate the prison, but the government pays for the service. So that's combining the two together. The government will pay them per prisoner in a bed. So that's how they're paid, how many prisoners they have in beds. Now, if you're going to get paid per prisoner in a bed, then the idea would be to make sure that all of those beds are full. So are we going to be in a private prison running programs to try and get people released so that they won't come back, or are we going to try and keep them there as long as we can because we're earning money off them? Any of you who've ever watched the TV show Orange is the New Black, I got about halfway through season 1 and that was it for me, but I got the point. It is a privately run prison, so the food is not good and there are less well-trained guards. So if you want to run a private prison and make money, then you need to make sure that you are running a bare bones operation and keeping those beds full. So it's driven by increasing prisoner numbers and a desire for efficiency. They are a commercial business and they are cheaper to operate because they will undercut the government in per day costs. Australia has the highest proportion of prisons in private prisons, but that figure may have changed a bit now that Arthur Gorrie's gone back to being government. Do you see an ethical problem here at all, where we're putting these people into prison and then we treat them like shit and expect that they're going to come out and behave like normal, rational human beings? So there are arguments against them. Accountability is a big one. Is someone watching them to make sure that they are accountable for the prison conditions that they are placing upon their prisoners? Because that's usually all in the hands of the company shareholders who are just wanting to make a profit. They have a vested interest in maintaining and increasing prison numbers. They need to be full to make money. And don't forget, we have this social contract to hand over punishment to the government, and the government's now handing that over to private contractors. Okay, that ends part one. In part two, we're going to discuss community corrections and victimology.